A special welcome on behalf of my father, Sir Frank Bowling, who would love to have been here and was here earlier in the year, but at 91 and trying to be in the studio every day, which he has been for his entire 65-year career, he'll be in the studio any minute now. It's great to be here, as Debbie has said, in this phenomenal space and surrounded by my father's paintings. You'll know that the works downstairs, orange-scented, dancing and skid, were made especially for this space. The background is that in 2023, I made a visit here with Gregoire Schnerb, who is a director of the gallery. And Gregoire said, we can have a sneak preview to look at the gallery, which was at that time just a building site. It was just a concrete shell under construction. And I took some photographs of that dusty, incomplete space, took them back to show Frank, and all you could really see was the scale, the size of the space, and Frank said, yes, let's do something. It was the inspiration that he needed to embark on a series of monumental works, which were, in his terms, would allow him to contend with the classical grandeur of the gallery. Although his ambition was never in doubt, it was only once Frank arrived here in March to see the works installed that he felt that he had achieved his goal. Well expressed by critic Heidi Ellison, who described, quote, the gallery's high-ceiling ground floor with its tall arch windows glowing with masterly and sumptuous-coloured monumental abstract paintings, creating a kind of cathedral of painting. Today we have the opportunity to reflect on the works on display here, upstairs and downstairs, and to set these in the context of Frank's artistic practice that touches on 8 decades, from the 1950s to the 2020s, to think about the process of making and also the career in the admixture of artistic traditions in which his career can be located. Finally, a word on collegial etiquette. I'm conscious that my father's work evokes strong emotions and that scholarly arguments about how his work can best be interpreted have in the past been heated, sometimes even spiky and acrimonious. I've heard raised voices. We've even had tears at a similar occasion. So I'm hoping today's event will be, our conversations will be measured, respectful and inclusive. And while the conveners, Ed and Altair, have asked 6 people well acquainted with Frank's practice to animate today's discussion, to raise questions and identify new lines of inquiry, and the facilitators will endeavour to create a space here in Paris to hear new voices and generate fresh perspectives. Without any further ado, over to you, Altair.
Thank you, Ben. I'm Altair Brandon-Salmon from Stanford University. It's my great pleasure to be the co-convener of this study day. Before I go on, I want to just thank Ben Bowling, Susie Chamland of the Frank Bowling Studio for their extraordinary generosity and help over the past year or so in which this has come together. I want to thank Debbie Hilliard and the whole Hauser and Wirth team for their expertise, their time, and commitment to Bowling's work and to this day particularly. And finally, I want to thank Ed Kettleborough from Bristol University, my co-convener here, who's going to be talking to you at the end. I just want us to pause for a moment before we begin and briefly take stock of the work that is in this show. As you've seen, they're enormous works, like a Baroque altarpiece. And they can be hard to see. You have to take a step back, you have to move forward, you have to get closer to understand how they're constructed and see their force in action upon you. Wadi Route 1, which is just right over there, from 2011, really represents the rich elusiveness of Bowling's work. Seen at first, a central oblong of purple paint lies below a river of red, green, cream and yellow tones seems to reference abstract expressionist painting and also the collage work of Matisse. Yet when we look closer, we see stylized lines of leaves and decorative shapes. In the triangle of coagulated blood red paint in the lower corner are the outlines of even larger leaves and branches, stencils. What initially reads as a powerful expression of abstract color becomes an even denser object. The name references the Arabic term for seasonal river valleys in which lie dry most of the year. One of the most famous is Wadi Rum in Jordan, where upon the sheer rock faces are thousands of ancient petroglyphs of humans and animals, so that the very stone itself becomes a medium for mark making. Bolling's work has this double movement to it, both engaging with post-war modernism and with the very origins of art itself. Wadi Route 1 conjures up the decorative patination of Arabic textiles. A medium of control and precision which finds its analogue in Bolling's own brushstrokes, where his subtle gradations of colour are like the carefully controlled process of dyeing thread. His painting has always existed in continuity with this kind of sculptural work, so that painting, as we've seen, might have a paintbrush stuck to it, a coin, a spoon. The burrs of the paint itself stand proud of the surface very often, creating a tactile ridge where you just want to reach out and touch it. Wadi Route 1 acts as a reminder to audiences that the innovations of the 20th century avant-garde have, in so many ways, already been anticipated by art made outside of Europe. That movement, central to seeing his art and present in the ideas that his work suggests, is also a very real motion, begun when Bolling arrived in London in 1953 from Guyana, aged just 19. In trying to imagine the city at this moment, I'm reminded of the lines by N.M. Sido, one of Leon Kossoff's models, who described London in her 1964 fictionalized memoir, In the Beginning Was Fear. I came to London on a bleak, late autumn afternoon. It was drizzling, and I noticed that the very raindrops were dirty. It rained with mud, was the description that my mind registered gloomily. It was a grey city, post-war London. Yet Bolling never saw the world in monochrome. His art is marked by deep engagement with colour. Colour as a chromatic force, colour as a political metaphor, colour as a geography for his brush to traverse. In that sense, Bolling created his own world, not a world separate from our own, but a more intensely felt and perceptive world. Bolling has always sought to open his audiences to new kinds of vision. Hauser and Wirth's exhibition Collage emphasizes not just the astonishing fecundity of Bolling over the past few years, but shows that his art practice is essentially contemporary, like in his manipulation of color, one moment akin to the breaking of dawn, the next like a beautiful wound. It exists forever in the present tense. It has to be experienced by the viewer, moving around it, absorbing the painting, coming close and then far away. It means that an exhibition like this operates as a performance, unique in bringing together this work in this moment in time, in this space, before they're dispersed out into the world. Today's study day intends to maintain that spirit of performance which is immanent within the painting itself. Our aim is that it becomes a conversation between speakers and yourself so that we can move fluidly between ideas and responses to Bolling's work. The three panels, Paint and Process, Atlantic Artmaking, and Bolling's Modernism, are designed to touch upon some of the major themes and methods of his oeuvre, which spans over 7 decades now. They're meant, though, as provocations to thought and meditation, and your thoughts are just as valuable. Here we have artists, writers, curators, academics, and gallerists together to mark Bolling's debut solo show in France, and we want to achieve a critical mass in the conversation around his work. Thank you, you're all most welcome to be here, and with that, I will hand you back to Debbie.
Thank you, Altair. So our first third of this afternoon is Paint and Process. I am not the expert, and I'm going to resist saying many, many things. But you know what I left here when we opened the exhibition, I left thinking about honesty and integrity and the stuff that mattered The stuff that mattered to me was the stuff left on that surface. As somebody who studied painting myself many years ago, that's all I could think about on the journey home. How he put the stuff on and what the stuff was. And some of that stuff isn't paint at all. And it was the materials that I was left thinking about. So that is the subject of our first third. And I'm delighted to welcome Anna and Zoe to come and take a seat up here. As we said, our speakers are going to talk to you for about 10 minutes each, and then we're going to open the discussion up to everybody else. So Zoe and Anna, come and have a seat. Anna, Teles, I imagine, a similarity in the way you work as a practitioner, exploring the work of the artist through making. And then Zoe, as a curator, who has championed Frank's work, both in the written work and including him in exhibitions. We thank you. So I would love to hand over to you.
Thank you so much, Debbie. And it's wonderful to be here with everyone today. We'll try and keep it quite conversational. I'd also like to thank the Frank Bowling Foundation. And it's a really extraordinary opportunity for us to talk about an oeuvre that has spanned such a long period of time. And because so many of Frank's works hark back to his initial training as a poet and really wanting to capture a mood and a moment, I was thinking very much about what it meant for us to be gathered here in France when Frank Bowling came here 52 years ago to spend some time with a close friend of his, the sculptor Elizabeth Frink. That was one of the many pivotal turning points when he first starts thinking about what else might be possible with paint. And we know that throughout the oeuvre, there's this constant challenging of this question of what are the possibilities of paint. And in 1973, that was very much this moment where something that we see in a work like the Wadi work behind us, where we get that initial foray into what it really means to kind of pour and to see what happens with the work. But I'm interested not only in what results on the canvas, but how it comes to be. And I think with Frank, there's so much about technique that is not just technique, but tactics. And I remember the very first time I sat down to speak with him about his work and about what it meant to have a studio in London and the subsequent breakthrough that happened from having a studio in New York and then maintaining 2 studios, was in fact the sensation of cold. So what it meant you can't paint if your fingers are frozen. And so he spoke about what it meant to go into his London studio, kind of turn the heat on, and then go to the pub and talk to artists and to argue, as he said, to argue the toss, while the studio is heating up, to even get to the point a few hours later when one might be able to do the work. In New York, it wasn't a dissimilar situation where having such a close friendship with painter, sculptor, artist, polymath, as Jack Whitten, who's also like a really peerless carpenter, they used to do this fantastic thing to wind the meter back so that they would be able to have the heating without having to pay for it. But again, there was also lots of moments of them having these conversations. So Altair, in his introductory remarks, drew our attention back to the drips and the rivulets on that surface. But the way that the drying took place, Frank then positioned a paraffin oven, a paraffin heater nearby to help accelerate the process of the drying. And there are always those little details like this. You won't necessarily know that from looking at the paint, but you can see how it cracks, how it looks. There is this sense of wanting to ask the questions. How was this made? What went into the making of the thing? And I think even in how we're hoping that the conversations today involve each of you just as much as those of us who are up here, I think there is also a sense of really wanting everyone to come to painting with the honesty that you spoke of, Debbie, with this real curiosity, with this sense of not thinking we know everything, but really wanting to ask, how was this possible? What else might be possible? What haven't we seen in paint before? If we've seen a Barnett Newman zip, then what happens if that zip bleeds rather than is clean? There are many of these things that I think have always motivated how Frank Bowling has approached the subject, but equally always in dialogue with other people. So even as he began to think about what paints he might use, I think there's something important for us to think about, because we often talk about, to use Frank's own word, this extemporaneousness of what it means to paint, something that is quite organic. But he never fetishizes that. It's never a sense of saying one has to use only an earth pigment or a mineral tone. One can be just as much involved in an organic fluid process using an acrylic paint, using the latest in Liquitex. If anyone has been in the studio with Frank in the pre-COVID years, you will have had your nostrils singed and lost some brain cells from all of the different kind of solvents that were used. And we know that from the 1950s, that Magna paint, the whole miracle of it was that you could have this synthetic, an acrylic paint that then could become more liquid using these kind of solvents, the same as you would use with oil paint. And the fact that all of the artists who were working at the time were really geeking out on the possibility of what you might be able to do with paint and how you could push it to do something else is the reason why, certainly in Frank's case, there was never a sense of resting on one's laurels with one style of painting or with wanting painting to only be beautiful, to want it to be many different things, to see how can an accretion of materials, of gels, of found objects, how can that create this kind of snapshot of a moment? And then for the titles to then go back and to help remind even Frank of what happened in that moment. So whether it's something like Mel Edwards Decides, or of course, I'm very partial to a painting called Ella and Her Mom Zoe's Visit. No points for why, but my daughter was in the studio at Peacock Yard using sidewalk chalks on a bandana. And then Frank said, I want you to put the bandana right here. And it was just Frank, Rachel, me, and Ella in the studio. Actually, that's not true, because Hugh Locke was there too. Yeah, really cool day. And this sense of then what that became, we had no idea what it would then be. You can't even see the bandana now in the work, but you can't see what was under it. But to know that there's something almost fundamentally archaeological in Frank's practice is something that maybe we can think about. And the way that is really meant to be a joy of the constant discovery, rediscovery, and unearthing of what a painting can be. I don't know if that's been 10 minutes. I had notes, but I feel like since we're trying to keep it informal, I would rather just speak with you rather than at you. And we also have an artist here who can tell us many, many more things about it, not from a curatorial or an art historical perspective, but I'm very eager to hear what Anna has to say. What I would say is that those of you who have young children in your lives, I really encourage you to bring them to see the exhibition as well. I wrote a children's book called Meet the Artist, Frank Bowling, and I feel that young people have a far greater capacity for comprehending abstraction than we do as adults, because I think we often then say, it has to mean something. We want to know all the references. We have to feel that we know which theorist is being quoted. And I think that children often come to things much more in a sense of, wow, I'm drawn to that color, or there's something interesting about this, or they're just willing to ask the question of why. Why did you do this? And they're perfectly satisfied when the answer is, well, that's what the paint did. I pooled the paint on this, and then this is what emerged. And I think that openness is something that I find has been an enduring quality that's drawn me to Frank Bowling's practice.
Thank you. I think, just a bit of context. So I'd like to begin by talking about Frank's work has someone who paints and who once tried to copy one of his paintings called Lens, which was made in 1963. So Lens no longer exists. So to copy this painting, I had to rely on surviving photographs, on analysis of works around that period, and on Frank's own recollection of how the original work was made and how I should make the copy. So through these conversations with Frank and Rachel, I started to understand how Frank thinks about painting, so what matters to him and what is important in his process. So one of the things that it is interesting is that, and despite the complexity of Frank's work, is he doesn't plan. There are no studies or almost no studies. He just starts and decisions happen in the moment. That was already true in his early work. He painted very, very fast, and he used to paint on multiple paintings at the same time. I remember asking Frank, how he thought I should approach the copy that I was making of his work, because, well, I wanted to paint like him. And he said, well, there are no rules. I have no rules. Use brushes, use your hands, use your hair, but do whatever you want. I have no rules. That said, I think there is some sort of structure or an internal logic to his process. And structure here, I think it could mean many things. One of them, I think, is geometry, so thinking about visual structure, which is very important for Frank and appears throughout his work. And whether it's drawn or painted lines, masking tape, shapes achieved through the process of collage or maraflage or objects embedded onto the canvas. And I think these elements, what they do, and they divide and punctuate the space, giving the painting rhythm and balance. So good composition is crucial to Frank. I think the materials and techniques he employs also impose a very specific structure, in the sense that he works with what the materials allow. Early on, that was oil paints, palette knives, brushes, with the introduction of sands and beeswax. And then later on, he introduces acrylic, stencil spray, ammonia, foam, gels, etc., etc. And I think we can see all these techniques, or some of these techniques from these periods, resurfacing together within a single painting. So, for example, the pour technique he develops in the 70s. It is still very present in his work, but is no longer let's say, the central focus of the painting, or the only focus of the painting. So I think it's been folded into quite a broader and more integrated process. I think it's as if Frank has internalized all these methods, and now they emerge more intuitively as part of this ongoing expansive experimentation. And color, I think it is central to Frank's work, and I think it's both chosen and discovered in the acts of painting. So he responds instinctively to what's happening on the canvas and how the colors interact, how they push and pull against each other. And he often works wet on wet, and this is something he was already doing in his early paintings, and I think is quite a special thing. And how the process works, so the paint remains wet while the new layers are added, so the colors partially blend, merging in places, but then staying quite distinct in others. And so I think this process allows that sort of quite special lights on Frank's paintings. So what are these paintings about? I think first they are about painting in itself. And what I mean is Frank is deeply engaged in exploring what painting can do. So in its form, gesture, color, gesture, the texture, the energy, and he's constantly experimenting. And I think his work speaks to a broader painting discourse, both contemporarily and historically. But the paintings are also autobiographical. In the early 60s, his paintings were figurative, and they were often quite brutal. So we saw depicted scenes of beggars, of women giving birth, scenes of killing, and all sorts of scenes of violence. So they think they're quite raw, and there is that sense of pain and horror in this painting. So Frank is concerned with the depiction of suffering. And I think that concern never really goes away. As he moves into abstractions, he continues to explore this experience, but I think less literally. So I think abstract language gives him space to refine and to shift the emotional register. But there are still personal references appearing throughout his work, embedded in the canvas, and that's could be photographs of his family, the objects, found objects from his studio, and even the titles have some personal reference. So in the conversations I had with Frank, one thing that I learned that was very important for him was the emphasis he places on enjoyment. So he once told me that if I got frustrated when I was making my copy, that I should just stop and go home or go and look at some art and then come back the next day. That what was important about painting was about feeling good about it. Was about the pleasure that gives you when you paint. So he does value these aspects of painting and how that also might be visible in the painting. So the sort of freshness, or as he would say, the directness embedded in the surface, and that the materiality should speak of the act itself. And you get this real sense that he takes in the painting, in the acts itself, in the craftsmanship, in the handling of the materials, and we can feel this determination and enthusiasm. So I think some artists might have a more, say, detached or distant relationship with their work, but I think with Frank, there is something quite real and something quite present in the work, and I think the viewer can also sense that. But finally, just a word on collage from a perspective of someone who also makes things. I think collage introduces something quite interesting in the painting process. I think it changes the tempo, whereas painting is fluid, intuitive, and quite reactive. Collage, I think, is more editorial. So after you paint, you look, you make a decision, you cut, and then you just play. So it introduces structure, it divides the surface and adds rhythm, dynamics, and all sort of tensions. But I think also collages adds a meta-narrative, just as Frank embeds objects from his life into his work. So to adding pieces of various paintings or parts of found objects in his studio acts as an autobiography. So in a sense, painting is part of life, and life is part of Frank's paintings. Thank you.
Since I have a microphone, I have to ask you a question because I feel like there's a really fundamental question here about what it means to effectively like re-record an ad-lib, like if jazz musicians are having a jam session and something emerges because of just what they're doing intuitively, then to go back into a recording studio and then to try and replicate that means something quite different. So I know we're speaking about Frank, but how did you find that process then of trying to, in some ways, engineer the conditions to recreate something, I guess, to some degree of faithfulness and precision that would have started from a place that was, much more freeform?
Yes, I mean, I don't think even Frank himself will be able to recreate the painting, but through, I think it was, for me, it was like through talking with Frank and understanding how he made the painting, but it was obviously impossible to recreate faithfully this painting. So it depends on the process. I mean, the part of the process, of course, that is a lot of being quite artificial in the beginning, of trying to put all the figures on the canvas. But then I think you somehow have to think Frank in some way and maybe try to reenact some of the gestures so that you have that sort of, you give the impression to the viewer that you have the same energy or the same expressivity, maybe. But it is obviously quite impossible. Frank even made this painting in 1963, and he couldn't even remember what paints he used. So there's a lot of guessing and also trying to understand what
Did Frank see the final painting?
Yeah, he saw the final painting. You have to ask if he liked it. I think he probably was quite surprised because, obviously, he resembled Lent in some way, but I think what was important was the physicality of the painting. So I think the painting was, in a sense, a portal to remember the actual original, because of the physicality of the painting. It was exactly the same size, and the colors were more or less there. So there was, I think, this sense of remembering the original work.
Can you talk a little bit about why this painting was lost? And so what was the impetus of recreating it, if I understand it correctly?
Yes, I think I know that the painting was lost. I think Ben probably would know better, but I think Frank just left his studio, so the council just had to remove all the paintings that he left behind, and Lent was one of them. So I think this was around late 70s.
It's very common for artists to, if you don't necessarily have a market of collectors, certainly Frank was showing with a number of different galleries by the 1970s, one in New York and various places, but whether it's through art trades or other things, it can be challenging for an artist to also be their own archivist and to pay for storage. And so whether it's through fires or lending things to people and not being there, there is often, in many artists, kind of overall, if one were to kind of piece together the catalogue raisonné, there'd be a number of works that were lost, or their kind of whereabouts have been unknown.
Yeah, and that was a big painting. It was like 3 meters and 60 by 172. Imagine like an artist in London couldn't.
Yeah, you're not just going to have that in your bedsit. House share.
About the painting Lent then, you mentioned 1963. Is that the year of the original painting?
Yeah.
So that would have been in more of like a figurative mode then. I was wondering if you could maybe just describe like what the painting is of, or like what's like in the painting, and maybe just if we can like think about or talk about like the difference between trying to recreate a painting that is figurative as opposed to the work here, which is of course very abstract, and the sort of complications that either one or the affordances that either one of those allow for. So I guess firstly, if you can just break down what Lent actually was.
Yeah, so Lent was a painting about, I guess, the tragedies of war. It was a very so Frank used references from newspapers from the Cuban Missile Crisis. So also imagery from the Catholic Church and some memories that he had of Guyana. So what we see is on one of the panels we have a soldier and two soldiers and a man with a robe, basically with his handcuffed. It's a quite horrible, horrific painting, being basically dragged to be executed. And then on the other panel is the execution itself. So there's someone sort of quite Pope-like, that's Rachel's words, robe officiating at the hanging. And then we have a man also being, a body being flagellated, and then people being taken out to be killed. So it is a very strong painting.
Would you say it like quite an expressionistic kind of register of paintings of that time?
Yes, it was exactly that sort of figurative work, but also getting very close to swans and the mirror.
Impasto paint in some areas.
I'm really curious about if it's possible to say more, maybe you forget as well, but like the story of making the painting that's being recreated, obviously with the artist giving you their process. So for instance, are there layers that you start with before any of the figurative elements go on first, and then are there like a few layers for the figurative element? How does that kind of process of the painting unfolding, and the figurative and abstract and all these amazing textures and the chance-like elements kind of, play out day by day? If it's possible to give any.
I think it would be much more difficult to recreate the abstract paintings because of the level of randomness and all the accidents. So at least the figurative paintings, you would have the figures that you can rely on. Well, that was in a way my battle with Frank. It was like, how did you make this painting? And he was always resisting. I'm not going to tell you how to paint. You have to figure out for yourself. But he was still giving me some clues of some of the colors that he used. He mentioned that he always used the three main colors, so it will be yellow, blue, and red, and then browns and blacks and. I was just struck with like a very, being trained as a painter with a grid and then transferring basically the main outlines, just putting the main structure on the canvas, and at the same time was trying to follow what Frank was telling me to do with the structure and make the figures with charcoal. It was in a way a negotiation between what Frank was telling me and then what I was actually able to do technically, because it's also very different. Making a copy of a painting is very different from making an original work.
But Anna, you bring up something that is really important, and I think that for us to kind of keep in the room, that in terms of what it means, that kind of the challenge and the pleasure of painting for Frank Bowling, it's not going to be incredibly helpful for us to kind of make a hardline distinction between abstraction and figuration, because it really is about the gesture. It is what's possible that can be kind of brought forth on the canvas. And in that way, what might be built up through paint that we might otherwise think of as slightly sculptural, like when you mentioned the kind of foam or the gel, or the way that in many times, even when he was working in a figurative tradition, that the figures would kind of dissolve and come back to paint. And there was a way that he wasn't trying to replicate the fleshiness of flesh, but the feeling of something that only paint could convey. So I think it is helpful for us to really like stay in this paint territory and to think about that. And that's what's interesting, whether the works we're talking about are from the 60s or from today. What else can I say? Frank Bowling was a poet.
And
So in the 1950s, when he first arrived in London, had aspirations to be a poet, has written poetry, has had a very close relationship with Barbara Chase Ribot, who is not only a sculptor, but also a writer and a poet. She's written actually a few poems to him, but there's one in particular, I can't think of the title of it, but that's dedicated to him. And so there was always that interest in translating what one feels into these other registers.
Yeah, I just thought it was quite interesting that we've talked a lot about chance procedure, that love of paint, the way Frank over the years has always had this kind of ceaseless variability in terms of which directions he's gone in. Yet at the same time, Anna, we're kind of talking about reproduction and kind of having to remake a Frank painting and the possibility of that. And it got me thinking a lot about Frank's paintings in the late 60s, where he's explicitly juxtaposing machine reproduction of these pop art elements, which are of his mother's house in Guyana, or of photos of his children or of his mother, which are explicitly reproduced from a silk screen. Yet
and stencils too.
And stencils of the matte paintings, of course. And I just kind of thought, you know, how do you see that tension in those works, and maybe more broadly between that kind of letting yourself go to process and, you know, production in some way, but also that kind of element of freedom and control, and how they play together?
I remember I saw a video of Frank. I don't remember where he was, but exactly making a comment on this printing technique, because he used, for example, to actually paint his mother's house in Guyana, and then he discovered the printing process, and he said, "Oh, you know, it's much more, you know, easier. Either you don't have to do all this faff, you know, it just happens." So I think there is some sort of freedom from figuration, because it becomes, you don't have to try to make something that looks like, through painting, that resembles a house. It is a sort of much more immediate process to use, I think, the printing technique. So even though it is still figurative, the process, I think, resembles more abstraction.
Yeah, because so often that would be that whatever was used on the screen would only be the start of a process where then that figure, whether it's his mother's face or whether it's one of his children, would then dematerialize. So the fact that something could be reproduced was only just a kind of, you know, an opening salvo, like an opening note to then take something in many different directions. It was never meant to be a kind of a rigid reproduction. And I wouldn't say that it was the use of screen printing in a kind of Warholian sense of like faithfully showing something that is recognizable, but then modifying it so that, you know, there's one version with gold on it if you want, or one is a little bit more hot pink. You know, it really was a kind of a means to an end rather than the end in itself.
Hi, Anna. Nice to see you. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more about the wider practice of copying and the research you were doing in copying that led you to work on Lent.
Yes, I approached Frank in 2018 to ask if I could copy his work. I mean, at that time, I was thinking about his more like recent work, but then when we start our conversations, that's when he showed me the picture and said, "Okay, I'm happy for you to copy my work," and just handed the images of this image of Lent. So he was really his choice, and I obviously accepted that. So I was very happy to make this painting. Why he shows this specific painting is I think it had a very special place for him. I think it was quite a pivotal painting in his work. And yeah, I think in the end he just in a way just wanted to see this painting again, even though this was a reproduction. It was in a way thinking about Lent and all the process and all the memories that come with the reproduction of the painting. I didn't just copy Frank, I also copied another artist. And this was a combination also because one of my supervisors was Frank's friend. So he also, because it was a way of approaching artists, because if there wasn't this PhD connection, the majority of the artists would have said no, because that happened when I was doing this project without, let's say, an institution. So the introductions was with someone who, Frank knows.
Hi both, thank you so much. I'm Kate. I am very interested in thinking about your position in relation to materiality in bowling and being here within an exhibition that is about collage. And to me, you have both conceptualized this in very poetic and experimental ways. Zoe, you've referenced jazz, you referenced poetry, you've referenced improvisation, and Anna, the process of thinking about something that is lost and returning to it can be thought of as a kind of overlaying. And I wondered if you could both speak a little bit more about whether collage is a useful way of thinking about bowling, or the limitations of thinking about him within that framework, and just to push a bit further around the notion of collage.
Yeah, I think for me, I'd probably think of a lot of Frank thinks of himself as a painter. And so whatever he does, I am like, yeah, that's painting. Because it's, but I suppose there are other terms that I think can also be helpful. I think a category is only useful so long as it helps us get somewhere. And I think we can pick it up and put it down whenever we like. There are certain paintings that certainly have more assemblage qualities to me. I think that this notion of how a frame is created and recreated is very interesting in terms of the use of mariflage and what that means to strip something together to create a work. I guess I often go back to those early days where sometimes experimentation comes out of limitations. So whether that's floor space in the Hotel Chelsea and not having an easel, what that means to then be able to use the ground in a particular way. Something brilliant can come out of that, but it's because you're starting with certain parameters. Even when we're talking about some of the deckled edges on the kind of use of tailor shears, I think about it also in terms of the many relationships that Frank has and brings onto the canvas or onto works on paper. So one of the neighbors at Peacock Yard makes bespoke cravats and silk ties. And so sometimes there are kind of elements of silk and scraps of that. So even in the snail painting downstairs, while corduroy is the physical material that's on there, I can't help but think about the kind of the silk ties and some of the other patterns that exist in some other paintings from that same period. And again, I think the way that we think about collage, whether we're starting from a kind of Braque Picasso battle it out for like was the first person to stick something on a thing. Out of a Cubist tradition, I enjoy that kind of wider art historical framing, but again, I think in certain contexts, I don't think that Frank would say this at all, but I think there's something. I guess I like the potential for assemblage because it also makes me think of other forms of art making. So whether that might be quilting or something else. And again, I don't think Frank would want me to make that association at all. But I think that if that is helpful for people to understand what's possible with painting beyond a very formalist abex notion of what a painting can be, then I think it can be helpful. But I think that we needn't think of it as only one thing, I guess.
Yeah, I see the collage has a way of giving some structure in terms of the composition, so to break the actual canvas, because it's something that he has been doing in his work. That was very obvious in his figurative work, because he had these very specific structures, but then he always like finds a way of breaking the space of the canvas, of thinking about balance, the vectors, and think about center and how to basically compose with his image. And also thinking about sometimes all the things I hear then, let's say the fabric that he decides to then put in the canvas, and thinking has giving a second chance to some of the work, and maybe think about relations between paintings that he made before. I like this bit here. Actually, we maybe should turn it around. Maybe actually create some interesting tension here.
And very few artists have a kind of monumental studio space, regardless of the size of the work they're producing. So similarly, I know that when Across the Wadi was shown in the RA summer show, that was the first time that, Frank said he was able to get like the proper vantage point to kind of look back on it and see it properly, because it just about fit in the racking in the space next to the studio. But there's not, most people don't have the kind of wall space for, an 8-foot, 12-foot plus painting.
Has Frank ever tried to finish a supposedly complete painting? This is maybe for a...
in the sort of about 2020 and 2021, exhausted by making a series of very large canvases, he turned his attention to the pile of incomplete, thrown away canvases that were in a big roll on top of one of the storage areas, and then returned to them, painted over them. There's also his practice of painting over other people's paintings. So some people gave him paintings that were left in the studio and that he painted over, and then came back to them years and years later and painted over them again. So there is often a reworking. And I just wanted to pick up on this some of the sort of paradoxes here about the making. So the pinking shears are a way to avoid the fraying of canvas or cloth when you're in dressmaking. And yet the fraying of canvas is absolutely integral. If you look around, you can see that there's these frayed edges. So there's both using a technique that's going to prevent fraying, and at the same time tearing canvas, which has the effect of creating fraying. I want to go back to something Anna said about Frank saying to you that there were no rules. And yet he often describes himself as a formalist, a rules-based painter, with a particular set of rules about geometry, colour, shape, form, the history of art. And then he goes and says to you, oh, no, you just go in there and do it. And I wondered if we could say something about that, either from the floor or is there a way to make sense out of the claim of experimentation, acting extemporaneously and experimentally and improvisation, and yet the work supposedly following a set of specific formal rules? How do we understand that?
I think that's what Zoe was saying, the importance of actually having a specific structure, because it becomes quite intuitive and you know the parameters, and then that really allows then to be more creative. So obviously, I realized that there was some structure and some logic to how Frank was doing his early paintings, but I could see that he would just do that without really thinking much of that, even though it was quite important. But then that creates space in your mind then to think ahead of that, to experiment and be quite creative.
Yeah, it makes me think of the window frames in the New York studio that he painted, one red, one's yellow, and one's blue. Of course, that's primary colors. But what that means to provide a kind of frame on a world outside and the river below that is doing any number of different things. You know, one can't control the weather, the light, all of those things can't necessarily be harnessed, but one can approach them in a particular way. So when I definitely think of Frank Bowling as a formalist, because he's someone who so appreciates the most theoretical way of thinking about what it means to paint and why one would paint in the first place. But then the way that is expressed, I mean, fundamentally that question or even that paradox feels to me like what it means to be able to establish one's own visual language, like the fact that there are certain artists who we can recognize that is their work. It is because of the way that they start from something, but then deviate from it. So there's always this sense of both what one can recognize and the way that that's completely vanguard and different from anything else that would otherwise be recognizable. And I think most of us, the artists that we get most excited about, are able to hold those two contradictory things together and to keep doing that. And it's really, really hard. If any of you have like tried to be an artist and are no longer, then that you get that sense of that to have something that is distinctive and signature is kind of a miracle. But it takes a huge amount of work and a huge amount of forethought. So I think that's the thing, that someone can say there are no rules and not mean it disingenuously, at the same time as there is obviously, a method to the madness.
Do we have any other, remembering we're talking about paint and process, because actually there's some really interesting comments have just come up that we might revisit later on this afternoon as well. Anything else that anybody would like to contribute before we stop for a break?
I'd really like to thank Anna, because I think your research is really fascinating, and to talk about one artist's work and, to have your own practice as well, but also being wanting to embody and understand someone else's practice from within is a really fascinating approach.
Oh, yeah, I guess during that time I had no practice. All my energy was to make this copy. And yeah, thank you for all of your questions.
Hi, I'm Indy, and very happy to be here with thanks to Ed, Altair, and Debbie, and obviously to Ben and Susie. Sorry, Susie. So I'm going to not be talking spontaneously. I'm currently in the midst of a monograph on Frank Bowling, and so you're going to be hearing a little bit of an excerpt from my introduction. But the one spontaneous thing that has happened is we have Ben's Bar 1, which is from 2020, which coincidentally is going to figure in the way that I'm going to be talking about the two paintings that I'm going to be talking about, which is Who's Afraid of Barney Newman and Barnett Newman himself. And so those of you who are familiar with Barnett Newman may see some resemblance there, and we can talk about that. Whilst the title of Frank Bowling's 1968 work, Who's Afraid of Barnett Newman, is on one hand undoubtedly a provocation, on the other, the use of the abbreviated diminutive for Barnett Newman's forename, Barney, references a familiarity with the artist that undercuts the invocation of fear and the implied hierarchy Bowling usurps with this provocation. Rather, the diminutive speaks less to a generational or an aesthetic gap than a shared bond or affinity with Newman. As a black artist from South America, trained in England and then practicing in the US by 1968, Bowling was situated in not just the emergent global post-colonial current via rising Pan-African and Caribbean nationalist movements, but the reverberations of America's civil rights era too. As such, his transatlantic journeys between London and New York from 1966 to 1975 brought him into the midst of contentious debates about the visibility and representation of black art in the US. Produced in this period, Bowling's map series is reflective of these distinct yet interconnected confluences. Moreover, just as Newman had made a radical break in 1948 with Monument 1 from his earlier expressionist works, Bowling's Who's Afraid of Barney Newman was part of a series that marked his own departure, not quite from figuration, but towards pure abstraction by 1971. The congruence between these two works extends beyond Bowling's borrowings of its visual iconography. As much as one's bilateral symmetry, very similar to this painting to my right, was, as Yves Allenbois has pointed to, part of its spatial localization, aiding Newman's desire to create a sense of place for the beholder. Newman himself had emphasized its temporality. Quote, "I was concerned constantly in doing a painting that would move in its totality as you see it, and if you don't, there's nothing to walk into. The beginning and the end are there at once." End quote. After visiting indigenous Indian mounds in Ohio in 1949, Newman mediated upon the significance of time after discovering, quote, "Suddenly one realizes that the sensation is not one of space or of an object in space. The sensation is a sensation of time. The concern with space bores me." End quote. While ostensibly a map painting, Who's Afraid of Barney Newman is imbued with its own temporal unfolding, albeit very differently to the temporal presence of Newman. Beginnings and endings are differentiated in Bowling's work through the juxtaposition of the vertical stripes and stencils, applied with a sense of duration, so that both space and time, like his other more visible means of collage techniques, are layered and multidimensional. The application of dripping paint and the visible bleeding of the stripes, coupled with the phantasmal outlines of South America and Bowling's mother's house just above it, indicates not just duration, but historical depth. A form of temporal excavation is being executed here. Together with his reinterpretation of the vertical strips themselves, Bowling dislocates not just geographical markers, but historical ones too. The red, yellow, and green fields are markers of both Pan-Africanism and a transposition of Newman's 1967 work, Who's Afraid of Red, Yellow, and Blue too? Bowling challenges the philosophical presentism with Newman's Monument 1 and the hard-edged literal purity of red, yellow, and blue too, by alluding to not only his own diasporic arrival, but connecting it to a larger black diasporic history of both the past and the present as a rejoinder to Newman of the existence and significance of multiple and shifting histories and geographies. Rather than proffering a relationship that reinforces our sense of presence in the here and now, Bowling reminds us that this sense is always subject to change. Bowling's map paintings are a palimpsest of history, underscoring his own development as an artist in contrast to Newman's monolithic works that announce their presence alone. If Monument 1 is the encapsulation of a metaphysical absolute by which the viewer's own presence could be fixed in both time and place, Bowling destabilizes the existence of such absolutes. Yet, in invoking Newman, Bowling aligns himself to the very canon he appears to disavow and declares his own presence to the viewer. If this is a painting about Bowling's history, connecting him to a diasporic heritage, then it is also a painting about his contemporary present that proclaims his artistic one. The titular transposition suggests that Bowling is having a conversation, not just with Newman, but his antecedents too, mainly Mondrian. And this is not an arbitrary connection. Bowling's student dissertation at the RCA was on Mondrian, and his interest in geometry and line is evident manifestly in his earlier works. Bowling suggests he is taking on Newman in the terms the latter set out for himself. For just as Newman is, in one sense, inserting himself into a canon, Bowling's work attests the same. Indeed, there is more resemblance than not in their matching ambitions to simultaneously position themselves within a tradition, as well as recast it. Bowling's double consciousness of time in Who's Afraid of Barney Newman means that his historic and artistic arrival is simultaneously announced. It is not surprising, perhaps, that Bowling turned to maps for his iconography of historic and artistic arrival at this time. Despite graduating as part of the famous class of 1962 at the Royal College with a silver medal in painting, Bowling was excluded from two important British shows for his generation in 1964 at the Tate and the Whitechapel Art Galleries. The reason given to him by the curator Brian Robertson, quote, "England was not yet ready for a gifted artist of colour." Soon after, Bowling left England for his first visit to New York in 1965 and his first return to the Caribbean in 1966, since immigrating to the UK in 1953. It is not coincidental, then, that Bowling's first major body of work following this period is one in which Bowling relocates himself into a geographical and temporal space that not only clearly manifests his readiness, but his re-envisioning of a world that can embrace his capacity to do so. Moreover, his map series underlines his diasporic identity rather than holding to or being bound by any singular claim of national belonging. With this body of work, Bowling was literally and metaphorically putting himself on the map for the world to see. It worked. Bowling had already won a number of successful awards with global reach, including the Grand Prize for Contemporary Art at the First World Festival of Negro Art in Dakar in 1966, and a Guggenheim Fellowship the year after. But it was his inclusion in the controversial Contemporary Black Art in America series at the Whitney, with a solo exhibition within the series immediately following the group show, both in 1971, showing his maps, that became a watershed moment for the artist. The spectral presence of the stencil forms in Who's Afraid of Barney Newman appear like sublimated memories or a form of temporal collage emerging from the three vertical fields of red, yellow, and green. The political connotations are clear. The work was painted 2 years after Guyana achieved independence. Bowling made his objectives explicit when writing in 1994, quote, "Situation forced certain art-making acts the African American artists that smacked of expedience under the banner of black art. My own work, which had not yet developed into abstraction fully, could be said to fall into this trap." End quote. The situation Bowling refers to is the political climate of black art making in 1968, the year he completes Who's Afraid of Barney Newman. The retraction from this position is also reflective of the changing political climate for black artists and the changing status of black art both in the UK and the US between the 60s and the 90s, as well as the different ways both the artist and the scholars have interpreted this work over time. Yet, part of the slippage of the work's meaning is in the way it invokes different temporal registers, whilst acknowledging its own historical moment. Bowling points the reviewer back into the history of African dislocation and diasporic movement registered in the symbolism of his map icons and reference to the Middle Passage. At the same time, the extraction of South America upon a background of Pan-African flag speaks the words contemporary present of both rising African solidarity and nationhood. The transition of perspective between viewing the work as a flag transposed into a colour field or as a map marking different territories plays with the beholder's spatial and temporal logic of their own position to the work. It would be reductive, then, to read Bowling's work as only in dialogue with Newman. If in Newman's Who's Afraid series we are meant to witness colour as a transcendental event, we experience Bowling's as a journey with a different type of transcendence. The yellow day-glow stripe is less a zip in Newman's lexicon than an overflow or a fusion that flows into cascades towards the bottom of the painting, a precursor of the pouring of colour to come in later Bowling works. The strip of yellow is not hard-edged, and at one point merges into the green, and in doing so draws attention to the tonal variation in each colour field, so that the red ranges from a dark mauve, brown, orange and pink, whilst the green reflects the yellow beside it. The red bleeds into the yellow. Considering the painting as an allegory, if we can call the yellow strip a middle passage, then Bowling's middle passage has been transformed. Triumphant in its ebullience, yet both elegiac of survival and emergence. Simultaneously, as a centre line that scars the continent it sits upon and divides, it is a cathartic remembrance of a jarring displacement. Bowling relocates centre vis-à-vis periphery axes in which the West is dislodged from the centrality in his geographical association of non-Western nations with abstraction, and realigns spheres of influence such as South America in this work. Geographical reconfiguration becomes a recurrent trope of the map painting, drawing together disparate continents such as Africa and Australia, denoting political reconfiguration. As Cabina Mercer stated of Bowling's maps, quote, "They disturb the underlying codes of representation embodied in maps as documents of European modernity," end quote. Yet, just as geography is recharted, historical formation must similarly be checked, even beyond modernity. Like ghostly apparitions that act as timely prompts of how to locate ourselves between the past, the present, and the future, Bowling's territories resurface as such spectral presences through the colour fields, functioning as a temporal inversion of modernity and its lineage or order of things, as invoked by Newman and even Bowling himself. The dialogue that Bowling has with Newman and those before him challenges claims to establishing a clear or single line of origin. This indeterminacy is at the heart of the work, destabilizing both the idea of formalist purity or racial essence through the sublimation of time. Who's Afraid of Barney Newman announces its own ontological history, arrival, and becoming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak. I'm still very undecided as to what I might speak about, to be honest. I want to go, I'll tell you why. If we go to the panel, the outline for this roundtable, you've covered everything, Indy. You've done it. I mean, you've let me off the hook. This panel will consider questions of postcoloniality and the Black Atlantic, from Bowling's connections to Guyana, his network and critical practice in New York. We had that, I think, or through his wider legacy for Black and decolonial art in the present. I think you did that wonderfully well, if you don't mind me saying, with this look at temporality and in particular map paintings, and with a wonderful cue there on the wall to the Who's Afraid of Barney Newman. What I wanted to do is just kind of make a few sort of personal remarks, if that's all right. So there's no formal paper or anything like that. I just wanted to, I'm really struck by sort of being here with, you know, a wonderful neoclassical facade opposite of Giorgio Armani, this absolutely stunning building, and this community of enthusiasts, supporters for the work of Frank Bowling, and members of the family too, and the studio, and great supporters at Hauser and Wirth. It wasn't always like this, I have to say. I did a lot of my growing up while trying to make sense of why it was that there was little attention paid to the art of Frank Bowling. That's the situation I found, that I inherited, if you like, when I was in my late 20s, when I was first introduced to Frank and to Rachel Scott, and spent a lovely long day with them at the house in flat in near the Tate. I won't give you the address. I think you all know it anyway. And off to Peacock Yard, and then off to another gallery space where we talked about the possibility of putting on a show of Frank's work at SOAS, at the School of Oriental and African Studies, where I was then a PhD student. It was a very, very long time ago. It was the late 1990s, and it was very clear then that, you know, Frank Bowling, his art had not been given its due. And that was the situation that I was kind of faced with at that time. My second encounter with his work was when I was on the editorial board of the journal Third Text, and Rashid Areen was planning a book that I don't think was ever written, entitled The Whole Story, and it was about British art, and it was to have a chapter on pretty much each of the decades of the 20th century, and Frank Bowling was to feature. In one of those chapters, Rashid asked me to go and interview Frank and to write about a painting that had been little noticed, it seemed, called Mirror. And we spent something like, it was quite possibly a 7-hour interview that we did together. Frank and Rachel being very, very generous with their time. And I began to write about this painting in the context of post-war British art, of the Royal College of Art moment, the Slade School, Commonwealth artists, and so on and so forth. A history that is now much more familiar to us, I'm glad to say. There are lots and lots of chapters kind of in my sort of relationship with this artist. And what I wanted to do is try and be a bit more informative, but also spontaneous in response to this exhibition. So I won't kind of go into all of that, if you like, but what I wanted to do today is kind of come here and try and clear my mind of a background of study of Frank Bowling, and a background of, you know, decades of interest, but also decades of his own practice, just to try and look at the works in a new way. I'm really pleased to say that the first panel, I think, did this so beautifully, with the looking at collage, looking at materiality of this work, and two, you know, response as a curatorial response, but also the response of an artist. There are lots of these kind of hang on a minute moments, I think, when you're looking at these works, moments when, of course, one can only but notice, as it were, the signature of Frank Bowling working within within those rules, those structures that we heard about, also this tendency towards extemporization and enjoyment of painting. And that's writ large on these works. But the hang on a minute moment for me is when you start to get up close and find things embedded in these works. So these found objects, which are very, very fascinating. So there's a long list of them. I mean, you've seen them yourselves. We started with a spiral, a shell. We saw actual shells. We've seen the sort of detritus, I think is the word that Frank had used, of his studio, but also of everyday life. And Ben has spoken about that very well too. I was minded of, and this is the more informative bit, I was minded of some of the writings of Frank Bowling, and I wanted to figure out whether he had, in a sense, offered us a kind of a mapping, if you like, of this approach, whether in fact he was thinking through these very same sorts of approaches to painting at an earlier point. And if so, on what basis has he then gone on to do these marvelous, magnificent monumental works that he's doing today? We heard the word tension quite a lot, I think, in the first panel. The tension between improvisation and structure, for example. And that seems to me to be at the heart of a piece of writing that we recently, together with a colleague, Paul Wood, we produced a sort of Bible for art and art history entitled Art in Theory. It's a sort of compendium, an anthology of primary texts for anyone, really, not only for students of art history. There's about 360 odd texts in there, and one of them is an anthologized, edited essay from Frank Bowling, which we're very grateful for the opportunity to be able to reproduce in that book. The tension that he describes is a tension between an emotional response in art, which we see here everywhere, in color, in the liquidity of paint, in the viscosity of paint, in what looks to me often an improvised approach to paint, letting the material take its own form in its own way. That on the one hand, and on the other, what he calls a knowledge-based recognition. A knowledge-based recognition is exactly what one has when one notices that there's a discarded paintbrush handle, rubbish from medical examinations and so on, embedded in the works. A coin, which is here too. If I had more than one pair of hands, I'll be able to find you the quote. I don't know whether you're interested in, I'm going to check in with Ben. Do you want to hear some quotes from Frank Bowling that relate to this? I'll give you one. Okay, thank you. Which relate to this. So what he wrote about in his essay of the early 70s was about an aesthetic that intrigued him very much, which, as he put it, hinges on secrecy and disguise. I'm already in. Someone's talking like this. The understanding is there, he says. The overwhelming drive, however, is to make it complicated, hidden, acute. Being up front is so often given a double edge, often turning such things as language inside out. If I can give you another quote, Ben, if you don't mind, I would unpack a little bit more. what he has to say about that. When he says, I've moved to chuck in detritus to watch it swim and settle, I think he's talking about the same thing over again. The sort of duty of an art historian, it seems to me sometimes, and they're very worthy people often, aren't they, is to tell us about the history of collage and why it's so valuable and why it's so important to understand the wider history in order to understand collage as it operates here today. Collage encapsulates a lifetime of kind of innovation for bowling, it seems to me. And it enables artists to do a lot and to say an awful lot. We've heard about Matisse. We've not heard the name Romari Bearden today. We've not heard Hannah Hock, canonical figures in the history of 20th century art, who I think ought to remain at the center of any discussion about collage. When Bowling in 1971 spoke about an explosion of voluptuousness and amusement, as well as secrecy and disguise, I think he was talking about this bricolage and pastiche approach, it seems to me. And what of those moments in the history of art, when this kind of, as you put it, complicated double-edged approach to turning things inside out that he presents, what of those moments in the history of art when such an approach is not tolerated and is not welcome? That, I think, is what's preoccupied me personally throughout. I've been drawn to those moments personally, driven in the sense to kind of uncover them, to sort of turn the heat up on those moments of intolerance, if you like, in the history of art. And I think that these works are a vehicle for doing so and offer us ample opportunity for doing so. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
I'm getting a couple of, a number of sort of binaries or dichotomies coming through the conversation here. In indie, continuity, so the continuity between Who's Afraid of Barney Newman and Ben's Bar, separated by whatever it is, 50 years. So there's sort of continuity and rupture, continuity and change. There's something about purity, pure colour, set against the pollution, the mixedness of the work from earlier, but also present here, rules against broken rules, conformity versus errantry, joyfulness, and yet also horror and terror and tragedy, and something about history, the past and the present being here. And I think that the comments that you've made relate to this body of work, but successfully place it in the context of works made 50, 60 years ago. So there's no question in there, just some observations that there are these sort of pushes and pulls that seem to cut through what's being said here. So maybe we can just open it to the floor to get any questions or comments, observations about the presentations, observations about the work on show, questions for the panelists.
Thanks both for those presentations. I have in my head the comment that you made about Choudhury and bowling being missed out of those important early displays. And I thought about the future and what is the future of showing bowling and what context should he be shown in? What context hasn't he been shown in? How do we move from here with that history to a future of bowling's exhibition?
It's a great question. I mean, so that sense of like, it wasn't always like this. It's not always going to be like this either. That's not a reference to kind of declining success or interest. It's just that basic fact of temporality. I mean, many of us today have been able to speak from the authority of knowing the artist, being related to the artist, as it were. It's not, a certain kind of authority, being able to quote directly, I visited Frank and he told me this, I painted with him, or I painted in front of him, he told me this. And we're not always going to be like that. So the sort of future generations of art historical scholarship on and curatorial responses to bowling are going to look very, very different. And I was just thinking about that earlier on, that we're in a sense part of the historical context in which these works were physically made. And of course, Ben pointed out that the idea of the completion of these works being achieved only at the point when they were installed here, and Frank visits in March and says, now they're complete. So there's a kind of lot of contingencies around that, which are going to evaporate, eventually. Claims can be made now that future curators and writers won't be able to make, and so that struck me. And even like me with my sort of potted, personal biography of encounters, which goes on and on actually a little bit further into publication and work at MoMA and this kind of thing, with relevance to bowling, won't be made, forevermore. So I think that's kind of interesting. So what would the sort of maturing of the scholarship look like? What would the maturing of the curatorial response look like? I have a sense that it already has matured from sort of where my personal entry point to, say, the topic of Atlantic modernism or transatlantic connections or temporalities in the plural sense, as they're related to bowling's shifting locations between three continents in the 1950s and 60s. And I think, in a sense, we're no longer at the point where there's that sort of important registering of, the racializing of his reception, which I think there's an important politics to keep that in the frame. But at the same time, to understand that, in a sense, a lot of other things can be done as well in relation to this. And that whole question of success could be problematized far more. Personally, I think there's something kind of perverse about trying to gauge an artist's success when in the scales you're trying to deal with racist receptions. I think there's something very difficult about that. Something very agonistic and difficult about doing that. So, yeah.
Thank you for that. Indeed, what's your reaction to the question, the shifting context, and what does the future hold?
I mean, I agree with Leon, and I think we're talking about time. And I think, Frank Bowling hopefully will be with us for a very long time. But looking beyond that, I think Frank has taught me more about art history than anyone that I know. And it would be a disservice to the artist to not look for those things that he's pointing us to, that he is very firmly entrenched in the history of modernist collage, that he is thinking about hard-edged, formalism. He had those conversations with Clement Greenberg. What other artist do you know who's been able to have those conversations and have those conversations with Okwi and Reza? And we're very lucky that we have curators here today who are still working. And that sense of time, it's kind of amazing. And so I look forward to the art historians of the future, who will uncover all these other things about Frank Bowling. And I don't think it needs to be an either or. I think both Anna and Zoe have spoken very eloquently about this being able to be a rule breaker. Frank is somebody, it doesn't matter if I go to see him on Monday and then I go to see him on Wednesday, because he'll tell me something different on Wednesday and Friday. And then I'll have to speak to Ben and be like, Ben, please, could you check this? Because as an art historian, we check and we recheck and we recheck. It's impossible with Frank Bowling. And so for the art historian, it's not so much about the rules of art history that he's breaking. He's breaking the rules of art making and how we write about art. And that for me is like terribly exciting. I hope he carries on.
Hello, you can hear me. Thank you. Frank's writings are themselves slippery and beguiling. And I loved the extract that you pulled, Leon, around knowledge-based recognition. And I think that that's really where we are bending this conversation. What is the value of the recognition? What recognitions are possible? And how is he trying to evade those recognitions? And indeed, your work has been so important in thinking about these ideas. And I'd love to hear what you think about knowledge-based recognition, to what extent it is important to know Barnett Newman before you come to Frank Bowling, but also more than that, in terms of the exciting work that's happening now around Frank Bowling. One of the things that's moved me most recently is when you were speaking at the Brixton Library and you were speaking about Icarus and its relationship to Dan Bowling's death. And these kinds of invisible knowledges and biographies that exist within Frank's works. And we're looking at Ben's Bar, how you think the intimate, the familial, those kinds of knowledges exist below the surface. So something along those lines.
Okay, I think there's 3 questions. Could I ask you to repeat the first one?
The first one is, what do you think Frank's doing with knowledge-based recognition?
I've probably already answered that question in that, like I said, if you want to know about art history, stand in front of a Frank Bowling painting, and like seeing a painting by Frank Bowling, you won't understand. And actually, it was really exciting for me to see that Hauser and Wirth had put up, a Buford Delaney painting, and I would say that, a lot of these painters that Frank was looking at would be the same. That he's thinking, as Anna talked about paint, the application of paint. If you go and, go to the Met, and I don't know if they've still got it up, but Night Journey, when you see that 2D and then you see it 3D, there's something about, you don't have to be a painter, where you can just stand and you understand how kind of paint moves. There's something about the Frank that he's so expansive in the way that he really is a very generous painter. There are not many makers who can want to reveal to you as much as Frank does about how wonderful paint is and how wonderful art is. And so he's very we've heard from Altair and from Ben about how he's making these paintings today. And collage is just one technique. I guess I'm more interested in going to your next point about intimacy, about those hidden knowledges. And I think for me, those are the things that I'm interested in, like how he can move from bringing in Ben, or Dan to Zoe's child coming in and suddenly putting that in. And that's another way that he's collapsing time for us. He's saying, look, you weren't here in the studio, but I was here in that studio at that time. And what a wonderful memory that he's passing on to these generations, that he's done for his family over and over and over again. So that sort of life affirmation that he's doing is a kind of knowledge-based production, and he's carried on doing that. So despite his physicality, his mind is as agile as anyone that I know, because if you want to think about how a painter is thinking about his painting, again, you can learn from just looking at his paintings very closely. Something that Frank said when I very first met him, and I was asking him some rambling question about brushstrokes, and he said, I look at Titian, and he said, go up very close to a Titian and look at those. And he says, there's an article somewhere, Leon will probably know, and he says, flick, flick, flick. And you can see those, and those trajectories, it's all knowledge. And whether it's the knowledge of the personal, whether it's the knowledge of the art historical, or whether it's political knowledge, and I think that third one is really important. And even though he kind of skips between those politics by virtue of who he is and his diasporic black identity, I think that's a really important thing to understand, is that that politics remains.
Hi, thank you, Indy and Leon, for your talks. My question is for Indy mostly, but I'd love to hear you both comment on this if possible. Just given that we're talking about Newman and we have a work so nearby that is so clearly like 1.1, as you said, Indy, I was wondering if you could maybe comment on Newman's, his outlook on 1.1 and the zip paintings was very grand. He thought that they would end state capitalism at some point. He's quoted as saying he has very kind of high ambitions for the kind of outcomes that a painting like that could do. And yet we have Bowling at the time in the 60s modifying that, and then even now still trying to work through something or change something, not necessarily to change that outcome, but to modify the process by which we get to that outcome. So I'm wondering if maybe we can just look at the work for a second, and in what ways is Bowling changing that, the approach of 1.1, aside from, of course, the fact that the zip isn't completed, right? The zip gets stuck or something. What does Collage then bring to this conversation? Or if Bowling's trying to recover something that Newman left behind, or didn't think about, that he didn't address, what is a work, and I'm blanking on the title of this particular one, I apologize, but what is this work doing that is possibly picking up some of that leftover or left behind material, or the things that Newman couldn't, particularly in regard to Collage?
It's a very art historical question. So I'm going to try and break it down a little bit. So for those of you who don't know 1.1, it is quite a drab painting, kind of brown with a sort of beige zip that goes through it. I might challenge you a little bit, Artie, in just saying that one of the things that Bowling teaches me about art history, yes, Ben says he's contending. He is. He's going to remain a contender all his life, and probably beyond that. But there's also a way that he's thinking about personal histories, and to bring in kind of Kate's question, he wants to contend with Newman, but there's also that he understands Newman. People might know that Newman's brother, died by suicide. And that's why he started the 1.1 series and the zips. They became more than abstract for him. And I think the same is going on with Ben's Bar here. The fact that he calls it Ben's Bar, there might be a personal story there that I don't know, that Ben might be willing to share with us. But the fact that he's already generating this expansiveness into here is my lineage, but also I'm asking you to look into my own history and connecting that with a fellow painter, both contending, but embracing as well and saying, we have these shared moments of personal history, of sorrow. Those for me are kind of more important than the art historical. They're really important ones, and I don't see collage as just the material affect of what we see on the surface, because we've talked about those. We've talked about the prinking shears and the staples and all the detritus that goes into them. But there's something that Bowling is doing by personal elevation, I think, where he's using collage as another means to kind of embody history. And it's an expansive one that, despite his race, and maybe because of it, that it's a very human one. He's saying, I understand Newman, he understands me, and Ben and George are these people in our histories that are just as important.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? So, Anna, this is a good question. Thank you for that. So, Anna, you've had this earlier with your alighting on the meta-narrative, and I apologize to you for privileging art historical responses to Bowling, curatorial responses to Bowling. Obviously, we've got an artistic response to Bowling, right? And it sits within a history of art that, continues, and, you embody that, don't you? So I'm sorry for that sort of... it's not often I come across someone who's responded to his work and had to... I don't think I ever have. It's really unique, amazing, eye-opening moment. Barnett Newman doesn't do doesn't do the knowledge-based recognition element that we get in bowling, and amongst so many other artists of this, Greenbergian, late modernist, high modernist period and beyond. I don't think. And so, simply put, the very flat, those flat map shapes that the viewer can recognize places or continents at least is a moment of recognition. So we've got a background of abstraction, if you like, and then a moment when you sort of, oh, look, there's a shape I recognize. And it's the tension between those things, which, he finds so fascinating, and which he's kind of, putting forward, for want of a better phrase, as a counterpoint to a number of things that were happening in 60s and 70s painting. For example, the social realism of so many so-called black art painters in the United States, but also this kind of continuing sort of dogged adherence to modernism with Greenberg, which he obviously finds, less and less relevant as the years go by, but still really, really instructive. So one sort of description that comes from Frank Bowling himself that couldn't be applied to Barnett Newman is a quote that I just found and then lost. No, here it is, where he writes about a tradition of subtle, driven awkwardness, now stretched to the breaking point, now suddenly a moment not of release, but of explosion, of voluptuous, cynical amusement, irony and sudden change, complete, many-leveled contradiction, are stock in trade and automatic, and they're so automatic they're habitual with his practice. So it's an approach that he brokers in common with, in a community of other painters, in this transatlantic moment of modernism in the post-war, and he's still doing it now. I mean, that's what's so remarkable. It's a living tradition, and takes us well beyond some of the strictures and problems of modernism. The other aspect to it is when Bowling writes about inheritance, because he's not simply talking about an African inheritance or a black diasporic identity or so on and so forth. He's not simply talking about that. He's talking about an entire inheritance of modernism, which is a conjunctive space that's shared with white creative people as well. And that's what makes it really, really complex. And that's why it's almost impossible to sort of take Bowling out of the history of modernism and just place him entirely, say, in a history of, say, something called black modernism or some alternative racialization of modernism. And he has insisted on that throughout, and very persuasively. Yeah.
Comments?
Yeah, another thought on Barnett Newman and Bowling, and I guess this is something Kabina Mercer has picked up on in particular, is the relationship between work we haven't mentioned, which is his Stations of the Cross, and Barnett Newman's kind of early 60s, I think 60, 61 response to the Holocaust, and his attempt to figure that by going back to these effectively white canvases with very simple kind of black flickering zips down them. And I know Kabina Mercer's directly kind of equated those with some attempt to kind of figure the unfathomable, the untouchable, the kind of real of the Middle Passage, perhaps. And I just kind of wondered, in your reading of Barney Newman, how you kind of respond to that.
Yeah, it's a really rich question. It was something that when I first began looking at Who's Afraid of Barney Newman, it's something that I was thinking of a lot, and just really that sort of idea of a history that is important. I mean, Leon's talked about, well, why hasn't Bowling in some parts of, the way that an art historical trajectory would go, why have these been these kind of dips and highs? And I think at the point of when he was doing Who's, Afraid of Barney Newman, is that also that bringing in of the Middle Passage as a conversation piece to what Newman was doing with Stations of the Cross. I think there's definitely a confluence there. And to say that, again, thinking about this idea of modernity, or even is it a black modernity, or is it, this wider? I don't think we're in that position yet, because bowling, yes, I agree with Leon, exists outside of that, but the art history hasn't. So in a way, art history hasn't really caught up with Frank Bowling. Like Frank Bowling was thinking about these things that we are only just thinking about. We can think about when black modernity as a trope was coined. Yes, Bearden was talking about it, but it wasn't really being taken very seriously until very recently. You just have to go to the Pompidou Centre and look at Paris Noir to see how long it has taken. And so we are still struggling for those terms in art history to even be able to say, yes, Newman was looking at the Holocaust, and Frank Bowling was looking at the Middle Passage, and therefore there was something that he was saying that was very important, not trying to racialize or to kind of almost subdivide these hierarchies, but to say they have equal importance.
Thinking about the future and contextualization, so I've recently been looking at the cathedral paintings, very heavily built up surfaces, and there's a group called the Radcliffe's Cross, very visible religious connotations. Frank was raised as an Anglican and converted to Catholicism as a teenager to defy his Anglican parents. He was also I think it'd be fair to say, a practitioner of obeah as a child. His mother took him to seances. He was able to read the future. It seems to me that there's a bit of a gap in writing and thinking about Frank that I'm not sure that anybody has ever written about or thought about religiousness, religiosity, spiritualism in his work. And I wonder, is that, the red herring of a son interested in the biographies of his father, or is there some resonance, relevance? Is it present in this body of work? Is it present? Is that something that you have noticed, have thought about? Is there any work that has considered the presence of God, the presence of religion or spirit in my father's work? And if anybody else has noticed that, I'd be interested to know, because it feels like a gap.
I see Frank Bowling as a believer. He's got and what I mean by that is whether it's a secularized religion or a kind of deep faith in humanity, I think it comes out in the work, whether it's abstraction or figurative. I think in the early works, such as some of the birthday works, I think there's, as sort of graphically visceral as it can be to look at these works, there's something about a faith that's going on in those works, about the faith of women to deliver safely when there were lots of other men, and Ben can talk about the kind of the social conditions of sort of Frank's anxieties then. But you have to have a kind of faith to even be able to sort of paint those images. I think also there's a painting that I haven't really looked at properly with, I think it could be called Fish Man. It's an early work of, almost a kind of bizarre painting, if I can call it that. So it's a half fish, half man. And what little research I have is that it does go back to some Caribbean kind of folklore, Guyanese folklore. And there's those a little bit like we've been talking about sort of knowledge, that it's all there. And if you talk to Spencer, Frank's kind of long-term studio assistant who's been working with him since the 80s, their conversations, and I hear them, I kind of hear Frank laughing in a way that only somebody from the Caribbean can understand. And so as much as Leon and I can go back and forth, or we can answer questions about Newman, I think that thread of the Caribbean has not really been looked at in Frank's work properly. And And at the moment, I think there's a huge shift of understanding where Black modernists, whether it's someone like Bearden, whether it's someone like Basquiat, Frank Bowling, like where do they fit in the trajectory of art history? And yet I do think, and this goes back to your earlier question about where can we go with Frank Bowling, is to think about the Caribbean and to think about Guyana, because I think he said at some point or in an interview, he said like Guyana's always with him. He's never been able to kind of shed himself of Guyana. And I think that's also a disservice not to be thinking about how that sort of interplay of faith, he was born with this caul around his neck, and that's what gave him, or, his family believed that gave him this second sight. So I think there's something there, and if you've ever been in the presence of Frank, the first thing that he will do is give you this very sort of penetrating look, and you're kind of waiting for the question, and then he'll ask you something that, you were not expecting. And so I think there's something there about his own inner kind of faith, his self-belief as an artist to push himself forward, to be a contender, in the way that Leon has said, when there's been periods of complete and utter neglect, and then also that faith that he's sort of doing this for a community of artists, whether it's Newman and Abex and Greenberg, or someone like Anna, or these other artists, and a whole branch of people who've come to see him. And that also takes faith, I think. Sorry if that didn't quite answer.
Shall I attempt to answer that? I mean, I think what you've exemplified very well there is how you can draw on threads and draw them together and create a persuasive kind of narrative or a framing for the. But I don't know. I mean, it's a real site of opportunity, isn't it? Whenever we have an individual artist, you can always reframe them in all kinds of ways. I was just thinking, Ben, that would be like a shot in the arm for scholarship on bowling. Rediscover his, the Afrosyncretic American shouter Baptist, sort of inherent kind of voodooism of it all. And I know that's not what you said, but there is a danger of slippage into that. And then, the fact is, when he's talked about the soul, the black soul belongs in modernism. I mean, you sort of think, well, is that a spiritual statement? No, that was about, a kind of creative and political, a cultural politics of articulation with modernism in order to achieve certain outcomes, such as, creating a space in which you can, for yourself, in which you can practice as an artist. So in a way, I mean, whether he's driven by a religious sort of calling to do so or not, it's not been patent, it's not been explicit. I mean, despite the, what one could draw upon in a look, in a glance, in a moment of encounter, or some, cursory remark or something. That said, because I do have some familiarity with the Guyanese context, that one could wrap that frame more persuasively around a number of artists, and bowling perhaps is one of them, in their relationship to such things as the elements, which I think comes out very strongly in his contemporary Aubrey Williams and in other artists as well, and the ways in which they've tried to contend with the fact that Caribbean experience is what's the right word? Not imbued with. It's shot through with religious significance, not least the role that Christianity has played in helping to foster a sense of community and in mobilizing resistance to colonial power. And so-called obia or Afrosyncretism is part of that, because of course it rests on both an African and often a kind of Catholic, the Catholic, what am I talking about? The saints and so on, right? And I've seen this. I mean, you could get very fanciful and say that the accidental in the materiality of the paint, and the experimental way in which he allows things to fall and take their own shape, is a little bit like divination within a Shouter Baptist context. I've been to Shouter Baptist ceremonies in Trinidad and Guyana, and what they emerge with is often a kind of, cryptic, kind of diagrammatic, accidental yet indicative kind of outcome, which in a way that could be what you see here too. So yeah, with qualifications, I would embrace that and wonder about its reception, because Frank's always railed against that at the same point, hasn't he? Yeah.
Can I ask one impossibly broad question to finish? You said that Frank's always railed against that, and in terms of legacy and the future, I just wonder if you could both say something about, how you think the future will handle the evidence of the paintings versus the evidence of, what has been said and recorded of his words, and kind of when you trust one over the other, or just how you deal with the contradictions that always throws up.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Indy, sorry, I just talked, and that's your turn. I mean, this is the thing. There's something we can't. It's an image, and it gets articulated to a text, a discourse. You can't control that. And there's a lot more going on than just discourse in relation to the meaning of an artist. For example, other things that are beyond the discursive, like money, for example. Or the just physical presence of works within collections and how they're presented in terms of their contextual presentation through exhibitions and so on. So, you could have a particularly, vivid idea as an art historian of what this artist deserves and so on and so forth, but it will just be swept away from you by, other tides. I think there's a sort of megalomania on the part of the art historian. They sort of think they can trap and fix and have a definitive take on an artist. In fact, we know it doesn't work like that, and it drifts away from you. For that, you need a politics and you need resources. Yeah.
I mean, I think Leon's already answered this question when he says that there will be a time when we don't have Frank's words in the immediate. And so it will be the work. But we also have a really good record of what Frank has written. And his interviews in the studio are being very conscientious. And so, we will have different records. And to any budding art historians out there or curators, I'm already speaking to many of you who know, we never rely on one record, and so we're very lucky that we will have. But it's always the work, it's always the work that you kind of begin and end with, and that's what kind of Newman was saying, and Bowling was responding to and saying, "I agree."
Yeah. I think this might be a good place to stop. I was just going to say, I just hope we're always, in the future, people will still argue over how best to understand this artist and so on. Not because he's somehow beyond understanding or it's some sort of curiosity that we can't place, but because, these things matter and there's a lot at stake. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. What an interesting journey we've been on this afternoon. And I was struck by a question or a thought that came up with Leon and Indy, talking about the future. We've talked about sort of the canon of art history where Frank sits in, and what will the future hold, and what will future curators think, and future art historians think. And in fact, all the 4 first speakers had met Frank and had a lot of conversations with Frank and were able to ask questions. And it's now my pleasure to introduce 2 speakers who actually haven't met Frank and who are the future. I would like to introduce Amandine Nana, who is the curator at the Palais de Tokyo, and Arthur Foster, who is a PhD student at the University of Illinois, art historian, lecturer as well. So we are going to hear a little bit more, which we already touched on in the earlier discussions on Bowling's modernism. So yes, over to you.
Okay. Thank you all for being here and singing with us the entire afternoon. It's been so productive and so wonderful to be in this space and hear you all speak and ask questions. And just one final thanks to Ben, Susie, Altair, Ed, to Hauser and Wirth, Paris for hosting us, for organizing the events, and of course, lastly, to Frank Bowling for the reason that we are all here. So on that question, and on the question of Bowling's modernism, I feel it necessary to begin with one simple assertion, which I hope to explore in these remarks, and frankly, we've already started to touch on in previous conversations and in the ensuing conversation afterwards. To put it simply, Bowling has never been an easy modernist. We might even have license to go as far as to say, Bowling is an untimely modernist. Now, I should clarify what I mean by calling Bowling an untimely modernist, and I'll unpack each of those terms on their own first. So rather than untimely naming a misfortune that occurred earlier than expected, say an untimely death, for instance, Bowling's modernism arrived quite late in the game, if we take his poured paintings in alignment with formalism in the early 1970s as an index of this modernist outlook, even if we saw some clues to it prior to then. These paintings and their modernist creator emerged in New York at a time when much of the art world, especially in the US, began to doubt the viability of painterly abstraction, the main American modern style, and its associated analytical framework, formalism. But untimeliness, by its definition, suggests something more than a mistimed arrival, either early or late. It also implies unsuitability, something unseasonable. So translated to Bowling's practice, untimeliness implies an inherent tension between the kind of art that Bowling was making at that time and now, and it follows his outlook on art as such, and the kind of artistic trends and outlooks that have dominated at the end of the 20th century and into the 21st. Some of these newly ascendant postmodern trends included the embrace of new and multimedia, and a return to the found forms and icons, a newfound importance placed on the explication of the artist's identity and experiences. Though, as this exhibition clearly highlights, Bowling would eventually adopt some of these gestures and forms, traces of Bowling's modernist outlook still exist even in the present and undergird much of his work made during this, quote, postmodern era, the works in this exhibition among them. We can see Bowling working through a painting like Skid, downstairs, the long history of Mondrian and the grid as the modernist structure par excellence, or of Rothko's floating rectangles of color, as is the case with Dancing, also downstairs. And we can discuss more of the modernist qualities of the works up here, perhaps in the conversation. We can locate Bowling's untimeliness, then, in his audacious, and for some unfashionable belief that something of the modernist outlook towards art, its engagement with and critical reappraisal of the conventions of picture painting and in painting, his interest in formalism as a mode of address, was still vital towards trying to secure the freedoms so many sought when Bowling first emerged on the scene, and still seek even now. Please recall, it is in the boundaries of formalism, he said in 1972, I'm able to test and ultimately prove my freedom. Which brings us to the second term of the moniker, the modernist part, Bowling the modernist. It may appear at face value a bit more self-explanatory, and I've already pointed out a few places where he's pulling in the likes of Newman, Rothko, and others, as well as our other panelists. Bowling adopted early in his career an outlook towards art, shaped by his education at the RCA, his reading of Greenberg's Art and Culture, and eventually a friendship with that critic, as well as friendships in New York with other Black abstractionists, including Melvin Edwards, Dan Johnson, and many others. However, as I began with, this modernism was never easy. That is, it was never entirely obedient to the rules of modernism laid out by the likes of Greenberg, largely because of its interests and investments in characteristically postmodern attitudes and forms. At times, Bowling eschews sterile and aloof universalism in favor of color palettes and qualities of light he cites as the same color and lights of Guyana, thus linking his sumptuous abstraction directly to his own biography. The stitched and collaged facture of these works, their multimedia drawn from the objects of the world in his studio, fly in the face of the quotation that I just shared about Bowling's fondness for, quote, those boundaries of formalism. Bowling thus strikes a dialectic between these two interests or drives between the modern and the postmodern, leaving him too modernist for his postmodern peers and too postmodern for some of his modernist forebears. He zigs towards the grid and then zags towards multimedia. Bowling's modernism, then, is one that thrashes between something modern and something postmodern. If Matisse was, to paraphrase his teacher, painting's simplifier, then perhaps we might think of Bowling as painting's messmaker. Yet, I still feel confident in ascribing something at the heart of Bowling's work, even the new works here on view, a clear modernist foundation. Why? Because, like a good dialectic thinker and modernist, Bowling knows that mess, for the sake of mess, doesn't do much. That mess only really means something if it's pressing up against some kind of system that it threatens to subvert and is in constant battle with. And I think that hits at the core of Bowling's modernism, this dialectic that strikes at the very heart of picture making. These pictures are not just effulgent expressiveness, nor are they rigid system. They are not pure mess, nor are they painting simplified. They speak to us in a language of pictures, but then trust us, that viewer, enough to deviate from the script and offer some new challenges. So if, as many have claimed, the dialectic is a core tenet of modernism, then the challenge posed by Bowling's dialectic oscillation between idioms of the modern and postmodern, funnily enough, anchors these works to something a bit more modern, even as they question the terms of that modernism. So that's my first argument to you all. But then one last question. Why does this untimely modernism matter now? Is it simply Bowling's turn? Is it trending? Maybe. But I think it's perhaps something a bit deeper, that perhaps we are drawn to this question of Bowling's untimely modernism because we sense in ourselves something of this same untimeliness. That perhaps as the world moves forward into new political paradigms, new global as well as local economic relations, heated cultural exchanges, and bewildering aesthetic experiences, that some of the tools which have helped us to navigate this new world we may already possess, but perhaps have lost sight of. Those tools have fallen to the bottom of our toolbox. That solutions we have tried once before might retain some helpful explanatory or critical function, even if their past implementations fell short of their goals. One such solution or tool that Bowling bids us to try is something like formalism, albeit a revised formalism. One that avoids the dogma and doctrine now associated with Greenberg and the like, and instead embraces the possibility of modernism's own undoing. But not merely for the sake of deconstruction itself, an attitude adopted by so many postmoderns, but rather to test modernism and to test painting, to see how far he can take it before he skids to a halt. So far as this exhibition shows us, that halt is not yet in sight.
Bonjour. I'm Amandine Nana. I'm a curator, so I really come here as like a learner. I'm not a Frank Bolling specialist. I'm someone that loves his work and have been like engaging with it in different way. I would say that my interest in research has been a lot on like the emergence of like Pan-African art discourse in the post-war period, and trying to understand how like his artist and like diasporic artist has been received in the Western world, has been like framed. That said, since like you were asking also like the future of like Frank Bolling, Ben Bolling is here, Frank Bolling, maybe it's interesting. I don't have like anything totally written, so I would just spontaneously speak. I feel like, and why it's important for me that like Frank Bolling is now shown in Paris as myself a curator in this city, and what does like understanding modernity through Frank Bolling is still like very important right now. I think that there is now in France an emerging scene of like artists with different diasporic background who are also facing the same question as like these diasporic post-war artists were facing, and what has been also described by Kobena Mercer as like, I think as like the burden of being a Black artist, or not like, and it has been discussed before, like, or not being totally labeled as a Black artist, but also like wanting in his work praxis to engage with like global Black politic. I think this tension is something that is still very much in tension, debate among like contemporary artists is something very still present. So to me as a young curator, it's important to come back to this history of post-war period to see that this is the same question, the same challenges that like emerging artists and contemporary artists from diasporic background are facing now. That said, it's also like when you invited me to also like meditate on this like meaning of Frank Bolling in Paris, knowing that he didn't have like a Paris connection throughout his transatlantic like circulation. Although Paris has been a city hosting a lot of like artists from all around the world, and at the same time, he's someone that also engaged with like French artists and thinking about modernity. Especially this exhibition is also like connected with Matisse. There is this piece like, there is a question of collages, and like Matisse also in his later career from like the 1950s, starting his like Nu Bleu. And in the exhibition, there is this piece that is very interesting because the title is like a small one at the entrance. The title is like Back to Snail. And snail, so escargot en français. Snail is also a title like a 1953 Matisse work. And I like this connection of Back to Snail, and knowing that like Frank Bolling has said that like Matisse Snail was one of his favorite work. So I don't know if it's totally like a reference to it, but I like to think like with this context of like this exhibition on collages, on his collages work, and having this small piece like that also has this like connection. I think it's interesting to like if I have to bridge this gap between Matisse and Frank Bolling, that both like Matisse is an artist that his career span across like more than 50 years, but like he has been one of the main artists in France from the early 20th century who has been shaping this like modern art discourse with like Fauvism. But what is interesting me is like as someone who has learned and studied art history in France, where like the regular story that we tell us is like the story of like Matisse introducing African art to Picasso, and that led to Picasso, Cubism, and everything. So, and that specific moment of like the role that play African art in shaping also like modern art practices in this early 20th century is, I think, important, and especially coming back to those concerns that like Frank Bollin and other artists have after, with what does it mean as like Black artists to engage with modernity in a context where like when we speak about their art and themselves, how they frame themselves within an art history discourse, they have to refer to Western white artists. And I think this is something that has been triggering him a lot. And when we read his like writing, it's something that is recurrent on how do we frame Black artists' work, and like, as I say, this burden of not being too much labeled and racialized, but at the same time being proud to engage with this identity. But regarding modernity and how is it possible to bridge this gap between like being a Black modern artist that referred and engaged with like Western, and being also Western artists themselves, since they are diasporic, and the African art in it. There is this small, there's a small quote that I really love, and I think that you refer to it in like, it's not enough to say Black is beautiful, where he say that he tried to position Black artists within this modern art story, saying that these artists are the natural inheritors of modernism through the contribution of their ancestors in traditional African and modern art. The argument for an African legacy are often overstressed and at times aggressively asserted. However, there is no denying its emotional and political significance. It is clear that modernism came into being with the contribution provided by European artists' discovery of and involvement with African works, and their development often aesthetic and a mythic subject from it. But the point I'm trying to make concerns the total inheritance. I really love this excerpt because it's also like, when we say modernism, I've been someone really who used to struggle with this word, like what does it mean, like literally, and I think we use it a lot sometimes. But what I love also with this excerpt is like the way we position, we say African art has been shaping also like modern art discourse, but without also just telling that it means colonialism, literally, because when we think about like how African art arrived in Europe and in the context of trademark and trade and colonialism, so it's a way of thinking about like building modernism. It's also like shifting like the temporality of what modernism has been like described in like, not starting like after industrial revolution, but something that started like way earlier with Middle Age and therefore with colonialism. So that's the point. And then I also wanted to, so talking about like École de Paris, and so I mean collages and connection with Henri Matisse. Like Frank Bollin was not part of the Paris scene and has not like any Paris big connection, but he also participated in a very much francophone event that was like the first world Negro Art Festival, first World Festival Negro Art. that happened in 1966 in Dakar. And so it was like a big festival with a colloquium, but also with like 2 exhibitions. One exhibition like dedicated to classic African art, and another one that is less known, that was called like Tendency and Confrontation. That was like a big contemporary art show gathering Black and African artists from different like global. And I brought like, but you will not see it, but I think it's interesting because like Ben has been telling me that you are not aware that there is like a catalog of it, but there is one, and we can consult it in Paris at Musée du Quai Branly. But I wrote, sorry. So here, the cover of the catalog, and then also like Big Bird, that is a work that like Frank Bowling has shown at this exhibition, and with which he won the great prize of like painting during this exhibition. And what is interesting to me is that the title of the show, Tendency and Confrontation, to me really embody the challenges that like many of these artists were facing. And it was a show that was very much diverse, heterogeneous. And this heterogeneity has also been something criticized. But when we study the show, what's like come out of it is literally also this like confrontation, tendencies and confrontation with like abstraction and also figuration. And what is interesting is that there were like, Frank Bowling was representing like the UK with Aubrey William. And it was also like, and there were also like other delegation, like the French. Okay. Okay, yes. There were like Aubrey Williams, Ronald Moody, and for the French delegation, there were also like artists that were based at this moment in France, like Gérard Secoto. You might have seen his work, Gérard Secoto, because he's like the one, the cover of the Black Paris show. The self-portrait is like a Gérard Secoto's portrait. And so Gérard Secoto was also part of like this École de Paris scene, like many other like Black artists and African artists. And I think it's important to remind because they were not connected to Frank Bowling, but they were also like facing the same challenges. And like it's interesting because there is like a piece of Gérard Secoto who was doing literally like figurative painting, but there is a cutout like collage from 1966. And I'm very interested with this period, and Big Bird to me really embodies this tension of like this moment of transition and experimentation where like we see like the Mondrian influence with this great background. We can recognize, but not that much, this one figure, but we are already in a kind of like abstract like painting. And yes, I feel like we won this prize. I know that like he said that he was not like that much happy, but we discussed about it, that he was not that much happy to win this prize because at this moment it's 1966. Being labeled as like a great Black artist was not something that he wanted more, you know. But I think that this piece won this prize because it was literally tendency and confrontation contained within it. And another artist that is also important to know, who was a kind of like the curator of this exhibition, Iban Jai, who is a Senegalese artist who was also like studying in France in the 1950s and then like came back in Senegal under like Sédar Senghor. and Ibajai, who is an artist that was also doing those kind of like figurative, abstract search of visual vocabulary. So I feel like he didn't go to Dakar, but like thinking this tendency and confrontation exhibition as like within us, questioning what is Black modernity and what was like these artists were facing in terms of challenge to build their own like visual vocabulary is important. It's an exhibition that is not that much studied, but there is like Cédric Vincent in France that has wrote a lot on it. And I just wanted to share this with you. And I think, yes. And I think what's interesting me also with this year is 1966. So it's like the year that is where he's also moving to New York, and where when he starts after like he's like writing on Black art, it's very interesting to see that like how his ambivalence with like this labeling of Black artists and like being labeled as a Black artist with winning this prize and wanting to distancing himself from that. But after a few years, in 1969, in one of his texts called Discussion on Black Art, I don't have a quote here, but where literally this text is about like him criticizing this new generation of Black artists who don't want to be labeled as Black artists. So not criticizing, but meditating on it and reflect what does it mean. And I think that throughout his writing and throughout this like period from 1966 to later in his writing, there is always this like, difficulty and ambivalence. But that is not like, that's just say about not just him, but like largely speaking, like what all these artists were facing.
Arthur, and thank you, Amandine. Both of you asking really lots of really interesting questions, and I'm wondering whether there are any thoughts and comments from.
Thank you. I'm just reflecting for both of you on this perhaps relationship, but also tension between history, time, and modernism, which you've all kind of spoken about in different ways. And we know that Bowling is deeply invested in the history of art. And we heard how he goes and looks at Titian and is studying the brush strokes and that flick motion, right? It's something that is a point of inspiration, a point of departure for him. But then, as you point out, Artie, that there's a way that his own art doesn't fit neatly into these kind of constructed categories created by historians, curators, critics, particularly in the 20th century. And as you've been pointing out, Amandine, he's engaging with perhaps alternative histories that haven't been given vision to in Britain and France, as they should have been, or only very recently emerging into a public view. And I wonder if both of you could reflect on the way that Bowling's art moves between history, modernism, and time. Is this a temporal question? Is this actually a critical question? What are your thoughts?
I think it's also like visual question, materiality. I think that like his practice itself like contend with this tension in terms of times, modernity and temporality. Even here, like we have been mentioning it, but like Collage's practice, I mentioned like Matisse, but to me it's not the same way Matisse was like using like collages and Frank Bowling he's using collages. I think that in the collages there is already something about like assembling these temporalities with like object found to now, and I think it's not just a question of I think it has to start with the materiality of his practice and the different layers that already address that.
If you could restate the question again, just so I can answer it.
I'm just thinking about this relationship between, perhaps, as Amandine just put it, is sort of history as practice, right? He's learning, he's taking things from other artists, building upon that, and then the sort of history that we as art historians or as curators kind of imposed on the work, to your point about his timeliness or untimeliness. And, maybe that means we need to think of a different kind of history that can accommodate bowling's work, because if our history doesn't accommodate it, then there must be something wrong with our categories, right? And the work is, in that sense, a work of history too.
Well, in that sense, then, I think that the fact that he is always a little bit out of time with his time is so important. He's keeping the culture moving, to use a phrase by Greenberg. So at a time when abstraction was in decline, he was trying to find what was still vital about it and helpful about it, what was still possibly a progressive about it. At a time right now when, say, multimedia, or even more than multimedia, I would say right now the kind of the art form that seems to be encroaching everywhere is installation and experience, right? Here we have frames and borders on all of them, not actual frames like the one in the corner, Wadi, but every single one of these, he frames and tells you, this is not an experience to get lost in and to walk through. This is a discrete painting, and to treat that on its own terms. And I think that that is perhaps, I guess, to use my own term, an untimely approach to picture making, because so many artists now want to sort of explode the border of the painting into something else, for you to kind of get lost in it. And bowling says, get lost for a while, but there is still a border here. When you want to kind of fall into the paintings, like this one back here, such depth to it, but then it snaps you back to the surface. It never loses sight of its sort of inherent picture-ness, to put it clumsily. So I do agree that it's a shame that such kind of critical attention towards bowling has taken decades and decades to come, but also I think that's what makes him such a treasure, and why it's going to be, I think, up to us to kind of excavate that for the future, because these paintings are not like paintings, at least that I see very often in galleries or museums.
I maybe want to also add something on another category than art history, because I feel also as a curator, maybe there is this thing around rediscovery of these artists. But I think in the case of Frank Bolling is not working at all, because he has been writing, he was published and he was curating 5+1. It was a period the late 1960s, early 1970s, especially in the US and New York, where these Black artists were creating their own spaces, their own exhibition, they were writing their own art history. And maybe this is now that the academic art history recognize it. But to me, I felt that, it doesn't, we can't say that we are rediscovering his work, because he has been literally writing also art history. So my first answer was about the materiality, but regarding the question of category, I feel that they were literally shaping their own category, and if he started to write on Black art and those many, he felt that it was necessary to write, because he knew that he was not the art historian in the academia or the critic that were writing this history. So I think it's important to pay tribute to that. And yeah. And also, yes, and when I'm mentioning festival Festman, First World Festival, of African and Negro art. I think it's important because it was literally a big artistic event, you know. It was like, not because it was not the MoMA, that it was not like also like a big art event. And like the same way that the Festac in Lagos in 1977 was also a big artistic moment. So I think when thinking about like other category of art history, also like what kind of spaces of exhibition we legitimate to say that like an artist was part of an art history. And thinking about all these artists, then like Frank Bolin, and I'm also working on a show of Melvin Edwards, was like a close friend of Frank Bolin. It was artists that were also like having other networks of exhibition. Recently, I was just interested in like Melvin Edwards exhibiting in Paris in 1984, not in a museum, but at UNESCO. And UNESCO, now we don't know, but UNESCO was like the organization and the space that was also supporting all these festivals and all these Pan-African artistic events. So there is another history of art. It was also like shift the spaces that we like see as art spaces, and so like outside of museum.
Thank you, Amandine. Any more? Yes.
I think it's important, as much as Bowling is invested in legacies of modernism, to remember that he is a contemporary artist and that he is working every day for 2 hours and going into the studio, and the work that is being made has its own life force. And I wondered, Amandine, if you could speak to your own experiences at the Palais de Tokyo right now and the current research priorities that you have, and how he might fit within contemporary narratives, and also more contemporary artists, painters, who you think might be interesting in conversation with him.
So I joined Palais Tokyo 2 years ago, and I have a show right now that is called, like, it's a participatory exhibition called Collective Joy. And I'm working on this upcoming show of like Melvin Edwards, that is the friends of like Frank Bolling, and within the framework of like exhibition carte blanche given to Naomi Beckwith next fall, with this topic of like the reception of like Francophone thought in American art. So there is a group show that where I'm investing in as like co-curator, and she's like the artistic director and main curator. And there is this solo show of Melvin Edwards where I'm also like co-curating with François Piron, my colleague. So this is what is coming, and it's interesting because like I was thinking about Frank Bolling, and we discussed it for like this group this project season. But there is a question around like British artist within, like, so it's not me who decided at the end, but I love how like there is this piece that I love where like from Bolling called Melvin Decides, which situate also like Africa, and there is not a lot of like mapping from this mapping series with like, it's usually like America, with Africa in the center, and it's referring to an episode of Melvin Edwards withdrawing from an exhibition. And at this moment, like beginning of 1970s. And so this gesture of refusal is something that Frank Bolling like wanted to pay tribute to. And I love this work for that. I would have loved to show it in this exhibition. And thinking about like Frank Bolling as a contemporary artist, thank you for recalling that. That's important to say. And this exhibition is really about that. And like even me who knew Frank Bolling, but through his mapping, you know, and it was the first time that I was seeing in real his work, you know, and having to discover also his collage, his practice. I'm just like in awe first, and also interesting to see how a career can evolve, like from like the 1960s, late 1950s, 60s, and this tension that I try to address in like my presentation with creation abstraction. Throughout that, where we can feel a kind of freedom, like, and I think it's important. And I was just saying to so many young artist friends to come, because I want them to understand this kind of freedom that we can have. And after the tension, maybe the tension is always here, of course, but there is a kind of like freedom that you reach when you get above that. So yes, and connection with contemporary artists. In France, no. No. We don't have like abstract printing. No. No. I know, Julia, you're in conversation soon with Dimitri Milbrin, who is an artist that I love. But even him, I would not say that. I feel, maybe Jabril is shown at Marianne. There is a young Jabril, I forget if I remind his name, who is doing those kind of also like, but it's still like searching. I think in France there is a moment right now where we are seeing like young artists who are much more in this tension and confrontation moment. But it's interesting. And yeah, but then like in the US there is many others, but I think because there is a great like African American abstract tradition that is so important, and that also like helped Frank Bowling to shape his practice. So I can say like there is so many redundancies, so many. So yes, yeah.
Yes.
I don't know if it's a good comparison, but if I would try to find a contemporary artist that could also answer to Bowling's work, and that is British, I guess it could be maybe Choudhury. He's figurative, he's very contemporary, but in the texture and the research and the color, maybe there could be a parallel. I don't know.
Yes, thank you. Anybody else? Otherwise, I will hand over to Ed. He will make some closing remarks. And of course, we will go downstairs afterwards where we all have a chance to talk about our thoughts.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll sit for this, but I won't go on too long. I always know when you get tasked with closing remarks that you're the only person who sits between an audience and a drinks reception. So it's always a dangerous place to stand. No, it's a little over a year now since Altair sent me an email and said, do you fancy doing a symposium on Frank Bowling? And to have this afternoon kind of come to completion, having gone through that process of talking to Altair, talking to academics like Indy and Leon and everybody here today, and particularly to Ben and Susie and to the studio for saying yes and connecting us with Debbie and Lou at Hauser and Wirth and all the work they've done. So it's an amazing kind of thank you to them for everything that's happened. So yeah, before this, Altair and I agreed that I would do the concluding remarks, and I sat down and thought, well, I can't really write them until I've heard the discourse and the discussion today, which was a dangerous tactic, but something has come to mind. And I think what struck me is the way we've constantly moved back and forth between Bowling's earliest moments in the 60s, the kind of emergence and fruition of his career, and these kind of late great paintings here today, and his arrival in Paris, his arrival in kind of the capital of modernism, which in many ways is what this exhibition and event was about. But I kind of thought as well that there's an essential kind of parallel, a circling back between his earliest paintings and those we see today. And the paintings that come to mind are the Great Mirror, which is dated to 64 to 66, And it is kind of uncannily similar in size and orientation to Skid downstairs. And you can go and see it today in Tate Britain, where it's kind of pride of place opposite Hockney's Bigger Splash, and in the room where he's finally got his place amongst his RCA cohort. And it's really, for me, the painting that marks his transition from figuration and his early works, which very often feature mirrors kind of bisecting human bodies, abortion scenes, which are often quite grisly, as Anna in particular mentioned, and will know firsthand. And the way you see him transferring, and there's a doubling of Frank in this painting. You see the kind of earlier Frank sort of swinging wildly off a set of stairs, and they're the stairs into the RCA painting studios. And then you see Frank at the bottom again, and he's kind of dissipating into a cloud of paint. And it very much kind of signals, therefore, this kind of transition in his career. But I was kind of thinking, well, where's the mirroring gone? In that there's this mirroring between two stages of Frank's, and it struck me that maybe the mirror doesn't disappear, but it becomes these paintings themselves. And in particular, in those early works, there is, for all their kind of boldness, a sense of that kind of bodily fragility to them, the way that we see this kind of horrific, monstrous Frank, and then the Frank of painting at the bottom. And I think, thinking about Matisse as well, the way the snail has those marks of cutting and collage, the pins in the corner of each piece, to then see these works here today with the staple marks, the staples glued on the canvas, the cutting of the edges. There are still those ways in which the fragility kind of shows through the mirror. So I think, and yeah, walking in and looking at Skid, you kind of get that sense, the use of the metallic paint. There is a sense in which it's kind of a faded Parisian mirror of the 19th century in some ways. So yeah, and that really were my thoughts. The way in which, for this remarkable 70 plus, nearly 70-year career, 59 to, 66-year career, I'll do that. Maths is not the strong point. The way in which, despite the immense variety in Frank's output and what he's done, the way there are these essential themes he keeps circling back to. And yeah, a final thought that came from Artie, really, and this idea of non-synchronicity, which is something Dot Price in her essay in Third Text on the map paintings has picked up upon. The idea that perhaps when a painting is first created, it's in some sense kind of traumatic. It can't be absorbed. Yet there arrives a moment when we can register it, at which point we can recognize its importance. And that's kind of the moment of non-synchronicity, when something created out of time suddenly becomes of time. And that, I think, is kind of my closing thought of the importance of this here today. This is kind of Frank's coming of time, coming into time, perhaps. So with that, I will thank you all for coming very, very much. It's been an absolute pleasure. And my thanks again to Debbie, to Ben, to everyone at Hauser, to Susie, and to my co-convener Altair, and to all the speakers who've come today. I hope I haven't forgotten everybody. I don't think I have.